Then Ferdinand de Saussure goes on to explain some complexities of language, and those complexities make it more difficult for a person to decide upon the object of study in linguistics. I hope that you are understanding the object of study or the context of object of study. This is the object of study of language, of linguistic, of a linguist. How difficult it is. It is difficult because it's not pre-decided. It's not like botany. It's not like physics. It's not like chemistry. It's not like astronomy, where you already know botany deals with plants, and biology deals with animals, and astronomy deals with astronomy, and mathematics deals with theorems, and this deals with this, that deals with that. We have all the objects decided, but that's not the case with the linguistics. There, first we have to speak something, and then we have to find out what are the objects and why are these difficulties. Now, I'll quote important, technical problems that we face, or complexities that we face in language, which have been highlighted by Ferdinand de Saussure. First would be the problem of sound and hearing. He says that no word is spoken independently or heard independently, and we just cannot divorce the activity of speaking and the activity of hearing. Both these things go hand in hand. Therefore, he says, and I quote, the ear perceives articulated syllables as auditory impressions, but the sounds in question would not exist without the vocal organs. There would be no N, for instance, without these two complementary aspects to it. So one cannot equate the language simply with what the ear hears. So that is the first problem. Say, for example, if there is a person, he says the object of the study in linguistic would be the addressee, the addressed, the one who hears. So what he has heard, we'll take only that into account. But then the problem is, before one hears it, there is another activity that goes into the action, and that is the activity of speaking. So if it is spoken, it must be spoken to be heard. And if it is spoken, there is a relationship between speaking and hearing. So there are many things that come into the action before you hear. For example, tone, for example, expression, for example, attitude. So if you are just trying to analyze a word, a sentence on the basis of hearing, you are doing a gross error. So that is the first complexity. That is the first problem that language has. It has duality in phonetics. These phonetics do not only depend on sound, they also depend on hearing. But once heard, then there are a lot of things from the background that go into it. So it would be very difficult for a person to start finding the object of study. From where shall he, she start? That is the first complexity that Ferdinand de Saussure discusses in his essay. The second complexity or difficulty that he talks about is about the physiological and about the psychological side of the language. And he says, but even if we ignored this phonetic duality, would language be reducible to phonetic facts? And he answers no. He says speech sounds are only the instrument of thought and have no independent existence. Here, another complementarity emerges, and one of great importance. Is sound itself a complex auditory articulatory unit in turns combines with the idea to form another complex unit both physiologically and psychologically. So what he actually says here, that once you have uttered these words and heard these words, now you enter into the physiological state of this language. By physiology, I mean the vocal cords that come into the act, the ears which come into the act, the brain. Psychologically means the brain which comes into the act. So now, besides looking at the sound, besides looking at the attitude and expression, you will have to think about the how brain functions, how vocal cord functions, how ear functions. You understand? So he says that the language, enters into a more complex zone where reducing it to a particular object of study becomes even more difficult. And he says this is not all. Language does not stop here. It creates more problems. And the problems are, he says, language has an individual aspect and a social aspect. One is not conceivable without the other. Now again, the language has individual and social aspect, which means that psychologically it would be a person's thought, but that thought would be influenced by the social setup, by the social scenario in which he lives. And the meaning of a word, the effect of a word would be decided by the cultural context also. As I said, the word naked would have a different effect in a village as compared to city, and different impact as compared to an Indian city and English or United States city. So you know how social structure also affects the word. So it makes language more complex, more difficult. So he says, Ferdinand de Saussure says that by whatever means you try to define the object of study, you will not be able to do so. You will not be able to define the object of study for linguists, for the linguistic. Therefore, what is the way out? Now, there must be a solution. As I said earlier, that in this particular essay, what Ferdinand de Saussure would say, he would make language look like, a very complex, a very difficult, a very queer kind of a thing, where there is no beginning, where there is no end, where there is no starting point. You just don't know what to do with this thing. But then he says that there is a solution to it. And the solution is, he says that a linguist should work to study the linguistic structures, and he should include all other manifestations of language into it. Now he coins a different term and he calls it linguistic structures. Now, why does he say we should take up linguistic structures as the source of study? Because he says that in this whole case of language, there is only one thing which can be studied independently, and that is linguistic structures. Now, since linguistic structures can be studied independently, therefore, the object of study for a linguist must be linguistic structures. But then the question arises, what are linguistic structures? So, Ferdinand de Saussure tells you that linguistic structures are not same as language. Now, that is an important qualification here regarding linguistic structures. Had they been same as language, they would also not be in the object of study for a linguistic structure. Because language is already a very complex phenomenon, very complex thing with very complexities, and it cannot be an object of study. Since linguistic structures are not same as language, therefore they can be, defined or rather made the object of study in the linguist. Secondly, these linguistic structures are closed structures where a sound gets meaning, or it's a process, it's a structure, it's a whole where a word or a sign, in this case sign, it gets a meaning. There's a relationship between sign and the signifier. In this case, for example, I'll tell you that cat, C-A-T, which is a sign, it gets meaning of cat, a sound uttered, and a complete word which refers to a cute little animal. This process where we imagine or we say that cat refers to cat is the linguistic structures. And these linguistic structures are socially constructed. You need to keep this thing in mind. They are socially constructed. Why do you think cat is a cat? Because of the social structure. And Ferdinand de Saussure tells you and me that it is through these linguistic structures that human beings in a society are made able to use their faculty of language, So how do you and me communicate? Through a proper social structure and through a proper conventional structure. So he tells you that this linguistic structure includes an element of social and an element of convention. It is through these conventions and through these, social setups or structures that we understand language.